Welcome, everyone. I think we can start today's meeting. I'm very pleased to welcome everyone at the second expert workshop on environmental sustainability under the theme Climate Change Indicators for Evidence-Based Policy Making. My name is Dimitra Xinou, and I'm a policy analyst at the Environment Directorate of the OECD. Today's workshop we will start with the launch of the OECD Environment at a Glance in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is an in-depth analysis on indicators from the OECD core sets of environmental indicators, specifically for the LAC region. We will then have an in-depth discussion on climate-related hazards. And finally, we will exchange on climate information and data gaps in LAC countries, and we will also discuss a possible way forward for addressing them. I'll present some housekeeping rules. As you already saw from the video, there's simultaneous English-Spanish interpretation. So please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select your preferred language. I would like to invite everyone to keep their microphone muted at all times and only switch them on once you have been given the floor. We would appreciate it if panelists for each session do have their cameras on when they're presenting. And for all participants, after panelists complete their interventions in each session, there will be some time for Q&As and a bit of discussion. So please raise your hands using the raise hand button on Zoom. May I please also ask participants to keep their interventions short so we can have some time for discussion. With this, I would like now to proceed with playing a video from Jo Tyndall, the Environment Director for the OECD. Unfortunately, she was called in another meeting and was not able to attend our workshop today. So may I please ask colleagues to play the video and have it on our screen. Thank you. If not, then I can do it myself. Are we having issues? I don't know how to talk to it. Okay, Julie is doing it. Sorry, I think that we're having some issues, but maybe Julie, could you please try? Okay, there's issue. Okay, then we'll do it after we have His Excellency Ambassador Luis Fernando Medina Sierra from the Permanent Representative of Colombia to the OECD, and also co-chair to the OECD LAC Regional Program for his opening remarks. If I could please invite the ambassador to take these.
Sure.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Happy to do so, although a wee bit earlier than expected, but it's okay, no problem. So since this is a regional dialogue, I will make my remarks in Spanish. Okay. So please, those of you who need a translation, feel free to engage it right now. Okay, thank you. Okay. Bueno, ante todo, muchas gracias por la invitación.
Let me start by thanking you for the invitation to this very important event. This is part of the LAC regional program. I am proud to be co-president along with Paraguay. And for us, environmental issues are essential.
Sí, se escucha bien.
Perdón, pensé que estaba recibiendo señal de que había problema. Bueno.
Oh, okay. I was just checking if you can all hear me with no problem. So as I was telling you, environmental issues are essential, are vital for Colombia. We are a dual nature country. As are vulnerable, we are part of the Caribbean, but we are also part of the Amazonian with mega biodiverse system and essential systems. Our country has a lot of water reserves. Our biodiversity is also huge, and for all these reasons and others, environmental issues are vital, and they are central to our international politics and how we relate to our brothers and sisters in Latin America. And for that same reason, to us, the lack of information is really noticeable. And in talking about something so important as this, we require information for policy making. We have made great advances, not yet enough, and this meeting is a way to extend an invitation to the rest of the region to improve information systems. And aside from the invitation, we should make a balance, and we should invite informed people to discussions. We have information to share, information that can be used for discussions and reflection, that it is estimated that 53% losses around the world due to climate risks have increased between 1998 and 2017 in Latin America. So public policies to address such important topics is essential. We already have predictive models that are much better, evidence-based reaction systems, and we are building many things. In Colombia, we had a few years ago a series of natural disasters in the island of Providence, and that island was in compliance with good environmental practices, unlike San Andres, another Colombian island. And in spite of that, Providencia was hugely affected by natural disasters, and that caught us by surprise. Vulnerability, disasters, that's what happens. It will hit you when you least expect it. And it is important to have robust data in order to develop climate action initiatives, including traceability with transparency based on technical and scientific criteria, and not just regarding natural disasters and remediation tasks, but it is also important to focus on mitigation and prevention. Regarding greenhouse gas emissions, we all know the importance of the Amazon system and other systems in Latin America. We all know that the Amazon stops being an carbon exchange system. We can forget about our less than 5 degrees centigrade goals because it'll be lost. So it is essential to focus on the protection of that area and focus on activities to stop deforestation and work on the protection of such ecosystems. In Colombia, it is clear that we are lagging behind in terms of investments. It is clear that there is a gap regarding our NDCs. And it's been estimated that we require to invest up to 7 times more than we are currently investing to attain our NDCs. How can we focus our investments? How can they be directed? And all of that requires information. As I've already mentioned, we have made great advances. We already have a good taxonomies in Colombia, in the region. We have also made a lot of advancement in different areas regarding environmental assets. But when we look at the challenge is so big, it's so huge that anything we do is welcome. We cannot afford to continue acting little. These are crucial crucial years in the fight against climate change, and this has a great impact. And talking about another related topic, in the last months, Colombia has been talking about climate finances, and we insist on the need of technical analysis that are transparent, that are shared throughout the region to look about environmental services flow and financial flow, and looking at the financial architecture. The challenge is to combine the factual knowledge of environmental sciences with the knowledge of economic policies so that we can develop the necessary tools. And that's why events such as this one are so important. And it is very important to participate in this seminar. We are proud of our participation, and hopefully this will be a motivation for everyone. I am sure that today's panels are going to be very productive, and a lot of information will be shared that will be important for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your intervention, Ambassador. May I please now ask my colleagues to play the video message? We were having some issues before, but now I think we're ready. Perfect. Thank you. We do not have any volume. Charlotte, could you please try again? We need okay, I don't know if we're having issues. I don't know if anyone else could try putting the video on. Yes, yes, please. I don't know if this is possible. Yes.
Just try it now.
Thank you. Let's see. Apologies again for this. Happens at live meetings. So
Okay. It's going to be a problem because I have to put my sound on here.
yes, please do. Okay, apologies everyone. We're having difficulties with the video and the sounds. I would suggest we move on to the next session. So we'll start now session 1, which is the launch of the OECD Environment at a Glance for LAC. And may I invite Rodolfo Lassi, the OECD Director for Climate Action and Environment for Latin America and Special Envoy on Climate Matters to moderate the session. Rodolfo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dimitra, and welcome everyone. Buenos días en Latinoamérica, el Caribe. Buenas tardes aquí.
Good morning to Latin America and the Caribbean, and good afternoon in France. It is an honor to be here in this event for the presentation of something that is unique. It is the first time OECD does a comprehensive environmental and diagnostic for Latin America, and this is the result of OECD's efforts to develop a set of policies to help the region attain resilience and carbon neutrality. This is essential in defining long-term strategies, but also regarding compliance of the 2030 agenda. As we were saying, this is the first time a product such as this is presented. It has many good things regarding its design and its construction, strategic allies in its development, and these allies are going to help us implement many of the recommendations in this document and the policy documents. This is a diagnosis which is the first of 2 documents, or what we hope will become a series of documents focusing on Latin American climate issues. In English, it's called Environment at a Glance, because we have a historical platform that bears this name, where all environmental information from OECD can be found together. And this is a glance at Latin America and the Caribbean, specifically focused on climate change, which is the biggest challenge to the region, as Ambassador Medina has said. Environment at a Glance is then based on the OECD's platform at Environmental Performance and Information of the Climate Directorate at OECD. This platform is unique. It is quite novel. And right now, we have an opportunity, a privilege, and an honor to be with Nathalie Girard, Sarah Miet, and Miguel today with us. They are the leaders of the platform, and they are here to present it. So first, I would like to give the floor to Nathalie Girard. Nathalie is head of division Environmental Performance and Information, which is the most important product of OECD Environment Directorate. Nathalie, the floor is yours. Thank you, Ambassador, government representatives, experts, and colleagues. Please be welcome to our workshop.
I'm very pleased to be with you today for the presentation of the report Environment at a Glance for LAC. That was prepared as part of the OECD LAC regional program. It draws on OECD long-standing experience with environmental information and reporting, and on the new OECD Climate Change Initiative, the International Program for Action on Climate that we call IPAC. That supports countries in progressing towards net zero greenhouse gas emission. We all know that high quality environmental information is essential to address environmental challenges and implement effective policies. We also know that it plays an important role in raising awareness and in enabling citizens and stakeholders to participate in decision-making processes. At the OECD, we have been for a long time working with our members and our partners to improve environmental information along the full information chain, to produce coherent and reliable data and indicators, and to help countries establish effective environmental information systems. This is reflected in the updated recommendation on environmental information and reporting that the OECD Council adopted in June last year. Over the years, the work in the Environment Directorate has come to develop common frameworks for environmental reporting, data collection, and indicators that have become international references. One example is the OECD Pressure State Response Model, applied to the preparation of state of the environment reports and to the development of indicators that tracks environmental progress. And since 2019, as Rodolfo mentioned, we've been improving public access to environmental data and indicators with the interactive Environment at a Glance platform that featured thematic webbooks and country profiles, so far for OECD member countries only. You may also be familiar with our environmental performance review. They help countries to improve their performance by assessing their progress towards their own environmental objectives and also their international commitments, drawing on a broad range of economic and environmental data. So we've worked already with Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru within this framework, and we are just back from Santiago in Chile. The webbook Environment at a Glance for LAC that will be launched today focuses on climate change, which is a major challenge in Latin America and the Caribbean. Climate change impacts people and their livelihood. It impacts economic activity and infrastructure, and is intertwined with multiple issues that exacerbate existing environmental, economic, and social problems. The webbook describes the progress made by countries in the region in reducing emissions, improving air quality, and protecting natural habitat. Its production made use of existing OECD and other international databases. It revealed that although data gathering and environmental indicators have improved considerably in the region, data on the environment and climate change are limited and of varying quality. Major gaps remain, particularly on greenhouse gas emissions and targets, climate-related hazards, local air pollution, land use change, sectoral drivers such as transport, and policy instruments, among others. All essential information to support evidence-based policy in the climate and environmental field. We will highlight in the session that are following some results and some key messages. However, the principal message I would like to stress is that the lack of reliable and relevant information undermines the implementation of effective policies in the region and the monitoring of their results. So I believe it is urgent to generate the conditions and capacity to fill key information gaps and improve data and indicators on the environment and climate change in the region. I hope that this will be the first of many efforts in collaboration with key partners and countries to fill gaps, develop a core set of harmonized data and indicators for policymaking, explore new data sources, such as Earth observation, and find best ways to ensure continued financing. I would like to thank all the participants and collaborators, and especially the team that has developed the webbook. I look forward to our discussion. Muchísimas gracias por su atención y tiempo, y espero con mucho interés.
Thank you very much for your time, and I'm looking forward to our discussions. Thank you very much, Natalie. Very well. So as you've heard, this document is embedded into a platform which allows for very dynamic interactions. This report will be introduced by two team members, spearheaded by Rodrigo Pizarro, who is here with me. We also have Amy Cano as part of the team, along with Miriam Limster and Sarah Niet with all the technical support. of Ebenezer Aquillo, Luis Alot, Esmayor Sievert, and Epines Zamorano from the Environmental Directorate. So right now, Sarah Niet will take the floor so that she can walk us through the platform that is supportive of the report. Also, Amy Cano Prentice, who worked alongside her in putting together this information in a very dynamic way. Sarah, you have the floor.
Rodrigo, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So I hope you can see my screen. So I'm working in the OECD Environment Directorate, and I'm managing the Environment at a Glance platform. And as Rodolfo said, I'm going to present the new Environment at a Glance in Latin America and the Caribbean reports that we launched just today. So as Natalie said, this report is part of the OECD flagship project called Enhancing Green Transition in Latin America and the Caribbean, from commitments to action. And this project implements the environmental sustainability pillar of the OECD Latin America and the Caribbean regional program. And so this project aims to analyze recent trends and progress, as well as the challenges and opportunities of the green transition in LAC. The Environment at a Glance report, as Natalie mentioned, draws on the OECD's experience on environmental data and indicators, and in particular on the program on environmental information and indicators, and on the International Program for Action on Climate that we call IPAC. So the aim of the first program is to develop objective, reliable, and comparable information on the environment and sustainable development for use in international work, but also to support countries' efforts to improve environmental information systems and to establish effective mechanisms to inform the public and decision makers. And as Natalie mentioned, the IPAC program was launched more recently in 2021 at the OECD Ministerial Council meeting as part of the OECD horizontal project on building climate and economic resilience. And it responds to countries' needs for up-to-date, comparable, and comprehensive indicators to support climate policymaking. So this program already developed an extensive set of indicators for a group of 51 countries and is progressively extending coverage. So as Rodolfo mentioned, the Environment at a Glance is the OECD platform for environmental indicators. It gives access to the most recent data through interactive graphics and also provide key messages on major environmental issues, as you can see on the screen. And really the main objective is to make available to policymakers and the wider public harmonized data on the environment that are comparable across countries in an interactive and user-friendly way. And so, as you can see, the platform is structured by themes, and we also developed country profile. And the Environment at a Glance in LAC is the first regional report on the platform. So the Environment at a Glance in LAC focuses on climate change. As Rodolfo mentioned, it's a major issue in the region. But the other reason is also because this is the topic for which data availability in LAC countries is best, although, as Natalie mentioned, it's still insufficient. So here you can see the structure of the report, which reflects the OECD pressure state response framework. And as Natalie mentioned, the report presents the progress made by countries in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, decarbonizing their energy mix, improving air quality, and protecting natural habitats. It describes the level of exposure to climate-related hazards and some of the main policy instruments used by LAC countries to address climate change. And to give you a bit more details, so in the introduction, the report shows some contextual information and indicators such as GDP per capita, population density, or land use. In the climate change mitigation chapter, the report shows greenhouse gas emission trends, emissions by sector, CO2 emissions, productivity and intensity, also the energy mix and the share of renewables, both in total energy supply and electricity production. And this section also shows synergies with local air pollution through indicators on exposure to fine particulates and their associated mortality and welfare costs. In the climate change adaptation chapter, the report showed the exposure to climate risks and hazards, such as heat stress, extreme precipitations, soil moisture anomaly, wildfires, wind threats, and river flooding. And this section also shows the links and impacts on biodiversity and efforts made by LAC countries to increase terrestrial and marine protected areas. And finally, in the climate actions and policies section, the report provides an overview of recent developments in climate-related policies in LAC countries, with a special focus on environmentally related taxes, on carbon pricing, and on official development assistance. So in terms of data sources, the report uses the latest comparable data from OECD and IEA databases, which are available in the OECD statistical platform that we call OECD.stat. These databases in turn build on data provided regularly by OECD member countries through, for example, questionnaires or direct inputs into OECD databases. And the report also draws on data available from other international sources, such as the FIO, UNFCCC, UNEP WCMC, WRI, etc. And to finish with, before Amy show you more interactively how the webbook features, here are some of the key messages that emerge from the report. And for your information, the executive summary of the report will be translated into French and Spanish. So the available data revealed that although not a major contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions, the LAC region is extremely vulnerable to climate change. Indeed, land use change, urban sprawl and densification, rising temperatures, fluctuating rainfall patterns, and the increased occurrence of extreme weather events put strong pressures on the environment, which in turn cause biodiversity loss and also affect economic activity and people's well-being. But despite these threats and vulnerabilities, climate objectives are not ambitious enough, and governments of the region will have to step up their efforts to address these challenges and achieve a green transition of their economies. Another key finding of the report and the subject of this workshop also is that better information is needed to support the implementation of effective policies. As was already mentioned, the preparation of this report revealed substantial information gaps that hamper the implementation of effective and coherent policies on climate change and the environment in LAC. For example, most LAC countries do not produce regular comprehensive greenhouse gas emission inventories, and this is a major impediment to assess trends and progress in mitigation efforts. Comprehensive and detailed data on climate-related risks, which are essential to develop and focus adaptation policies, are also missing. And it is therefore, as was already said, essential that governments of the region further invest in the development and upgrading of their national information systems including the production of sound and reliable data on and indicators on climate, on the environment, and sustainable development. There is a considerable scope for improved for developing national statistical and monitoring capacities, in particular through improved institutional coordination and regional and multilateral cooperation. And we hope that the OECD can support LAC countries in these efforts. So now I'll turn on to Amy to show you the live workbook.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. I will now give you a brief demo of what the publication looks like online. And we think that its visual elements online, and as Rodolfo said, the ability to play with the graphs is one of the major strengths of the webbook. Briefly, en español, permítanme enseñarles muy rápidamente las.
Okay, very briefly in Spanish, I'm going to show you some of the practical aspects of this webbook. And the Graph Explorer, allowing us to research the data to compare and contrast countries' details. I'm sorry, there is a problem with the screen sharing. Give me one moment. Perfect.
I'll switch it back to English. The report you can find in the Environment at a Glance website. As mentioned, it's part of this program, and this is where you can find it. Then this will take you to the report, and there's two tabs. One's for the main body of the report, and the other one's for the dashboard that I'll show you later. Then here is the contents. As Sarah mentioned, it's got 3 substantive chapters. One is mitigation, another is adaptation, and the third is actions and policies. And then there's also a very thorough glossary that follows the same structure as the report. And then also quite a dense introduction on the economic, social, and geographical context. So let me show you what graphs look like in the text. If you scroll down, you can find graphs like these. And what we think is really useful is that you can play with the graphs. You can scroll over them, and you can select and deselect different categories. And we think this can be quite useful if you want to, for example, focus on just the forest area. Here you can download either the image as it currently appears, or the data behind it, or an embed link if you want to embed it on a website. Here there's information on the definition or anything to bear in mind, which you can also find in the glossary in more detail. And then here you can copy a link if you want to share with colleagues just this snapshot, you can copy it there. And then if you want to see trends, you can click this button, and this will take you to the dashboard, which you can also access by clicking on this tab. So before we were here, and now we're here. So for example, if we take land use, this is the graph that we saw on the report. And then if you want to go to the trend, you click here, and you can go country by country, comparing the evolution over time of this a certain indicator. And again, you can play around, you can change the timeline here. And same as before, you can download the data, download a snapshot. And allow me to show you an example from climate change mitigation. For example, if we go to CO2 productivity, this is, as you know, is the GDP produced per unit of energy-rated CO2 emissions. And here you can see a graph that appears as such in the webbook. Is the ranking of countries for the latest year available. But then if you go to trend, you can compare a country's performance over time. And we can add, let's say, Brazil, Colombia. And we think this can be really interesting to see the evolution over time. For example, here we can see how Colombia improves its productivity over the past 3 decades. And again, you can download this as such. One last example from adaptation. If we go to population exposure to hot summer days, This again is the graph that appears as it is in the web book, and it compares the latest year of this indicator with 1979. But then if you go to trend, it gives you even more information because it disaggregates this indicator by weeks. So this is the percentage of the population exposed to hot days. And then here you can see how long these periods of hot days took. So for example, you can deselect categories and you can see really interesting messages appear. So for example, in this country, in Argentina, the length of time the population exposed to hot days, they were exposed to more longer and longer periods of hot days. So we hope that tools like these can be really analytically useful for you. And the last thing I'll show you before ending my presentation is we have a number of maps that we also hope can be quite useful. They're in the climate change adaptation chapter, and you'll find the first map here. We feature one map, which is an example of one of the hazards that mostly affects this region, which is hot summer nights. And then if you click here, it will take you to a compilation of all the maps that we found interesting. So we have, let's see, 45 figures, and they go hazard by hazard, and also go sub-region by sub-region. So we show hazards for South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. And this can be really useful because different hazards affect different regions differently. And yeah, it's one more visual tool that we hope can be useful analytically for you. Thanks so much for your time. This is me done. Back to you, Rodolfo.
Bien, muchísimas gracias, Sara, Amy. Ustedes vieron al final.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Amy. You saw by the end of Amy's presentation very interesting maps, which I think are the first of their kind. Later, Miguel Cardenas will be heading another session. He will be presenting these climate maps and how this will be helpful in leading the public policy making, especially when it comes to adaptation. So now he will take the floor so he can walk us through the lessons learned after the countries have implemented these climate policies. Hastiem Cardaza is the head of the Climate Change Office of the Minister of the Environment and Sustainable Development in Colombia. Sebastian is present among us. I don't know if you could turn on your camera so you could be visible.
No lo tenemos conectado.
I don't think he's online.
We are having some technical problems now that we are returning to the normal life. The new hybrid situation is also affecting backwards. But if not, we can open the floor. Podemos abrir ahora la mesa para precisamente.
We may open the floor to the participants. We have around 117 participants online from whom we would like to hear about their opinions. If you go to the OECD website, you are able to download this document as is now. So of course, we'll be looking forward to any and all questions or information requests. So we still have a little time for questions or feedback from the audience. I'm going to draw your attention to Sarah and Amy's comments. This is a web book, right? This is thought of as a live document that will be updated as countries update their information systems. Ambassador Medina explained this very well. If we do not have updated information, which will eventually allow us to define our public policies, we won't be able to engage in our zero neutral carbon emission goal by 2050. This is why the document should be a live one, even if this is in the form of a 92-page document. You have seen that the tags are associated to the graphs and databases, which of course will eventually be amended as new information comes our way. So this is the state of the art, right? The most updated document when it comes to information and data management inside our climate information system in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I don't know if we could share the participants' view so we can see whether or not there are any hands raised or any questions. Otherwise, I will have a question. So going back to our presenters, particularly this question will be addressed to Sarah, and I'll tell you why. As you saw, besides greenhouse gases, we are handling the information as it is delivered by the countries. Less than 2.5 micron particles, including black carbon, climate enforcer, a very low shelf life pollutant. We also have sulfates, nitrates. These particles can cool down the planet. So the combination that exists within the database of short-lived climate pollutants and greenhouse gases. So in the last IPCC report, there is a dedicated chapter on these climate enforcers, and there's also a discussion that is prevailing in the UN and the COP in Marrakesh on the indicators to be used in the future in order for us to assess in the future the pollutants that will help us avoid tipping points in the climate, in the global climate system. So the question to Sarah, Amy, and many others is whether you can elaborate as to why the PM 2.5 are included in this database and report. Is this a groundbreaking piece of innovation?
Thank you, Rodolfo, for the question in Spanish. So Amy translated for me. Fine particulates, as you said, are related to greenhouse gas emissions. And that's one of the main reasons for including them in the report, to show the synergies between climate change and other important subjects such as local air pollution, which is also the major health problem in LAC countries. And the other reason is that at the OECD, and in particular in the Environment Directorate, and I think it will be the subject of another session, we are developing indicators based on geospatial information, which allows us to have a global coverage of countries for these indicators. And we were able to have data for each LAC countries on population exposure to PM 2.5, so fine particulates in all LAC countries. And we also developed indicators on the mortality attributed to this exposure, and also the cost associated to this mortality, the welfare cost in GDP equivalent. These are indicators you can find in the report with the trends and that we have in our environmental databases as well. Does that answer your question?
Yes, indeed. Let me just add that in Latin America, déjenme agregar que en Latinoamérica hay varios países que...
I will add that in Latin America, there are some countries already committed to reduce black carbon emissions. Evidently, right now, we don't have a conversion to CO2 equivalent as we do have for ESG, but they are already reporting black carbon in tons. Once this information is available, I am sure that Sarah and Amy will input that information. We are also having discussions with some other short-lived pollutants like ozone or ozone precursors. One important thing to talk about is synergy, and I will go into another topic. This has to do with environmental information and computing systems at OECD. We have a platform, the Environment at a Glance platform, Natalie presented, and we also mentioned some cross-references with IPAC. Rodrigo is also leader, and maybe Rodrigo could also tell us a little if he wants. He can also tell us a little bit about the existing connections between these systems, which may be implicit in the document being presented today, but maybe if you could add something about them. Yes, first, Rodolfo, thank you very much, and congratulations for the presentation. This work started time ago at the Environmental Information Division regarding environmental information in general, especially for OECD countries. I'm in charge of the IPAC program. This program is specifically focused on getting information in the field of climate change. We are developing indicators on our goal for emissions and climate policies. But mostly we have been working on developing a comprehensive database of relevant climate risks, which is the topic of the following session. IPAC is interesting because it increases the number of countries under climate change analysis. Now we have 51 countries or IPAC countries. They go beyond OECD, including large emitters and other countries. Our goal is to enlarge our database. The first stage will focus on environmental information. And for that reason, the webbook focuses on climate items, and it talks about indicators and so on. As the quality of information improves, we will hopefully begin including other topics. And let me say or mention two things about this web book. First, in many areas, the information is not comprehensive. However, there are synergies and relations between the different fields of information, and we will work on them. And hopefully, as interest grows and as our allies are strengthened, we will be able to include more information regarding our different topics. Thank you very much, Rodrigo.
Natalie about the relevance of this new product in the context of the OECD countries that we are constantly evaluating. We are developing every year different environmental performance reports. And many of the OECD countries are taking the climate change issue as part of their main environmental policies. There are recent developments in OECD countries that are linked to the region and specifically to these new platforms that the Environment Directorate is developing, the IPAC and the Environment at a Glance, with a strong and deep analysis of the climate indicators and the biodiversity indicators that are related with the climate issue. So, Natalie, what are the relevance of these new tools in the OECD context for Latin America? What is your opinion about the future of the environmental performance reviews with these new tools?
Well, that's a very relevant question, and it's very important for us at the OECD first to be able to better understand what countries have been planning in their climate strategy and in their adaptation strategy. As we do those performance review, we are realizing that we can offer some good practices that are being done elsewhere by comparing policies that are taken in other countries, by offering also some advice on how better to monitor some of the climate objectives that countries have set for themselves for 2030 and also for 2050. And because we are able to provide more harmonized and coherent data across countries. So it's a very efficient tool to help countries to maneuver in their ecological and energy transition, as well as for us at the OECD to make sure that we are understanding what countries have been doing. So the online platform, as well as the detailed underlying data by sector, are very important tools for us.
Muchas gracias, Natalie. Yo quiero mencionar que como
Thank you, Natalie. The agendas of the UN conventions for environmental issues are starting to overlap: climate change, biodiversity, desertification. And with this overlap, it becomes more important to have complex indexes and indicators. People are already coming to ask a carbon footprint of plastics polluting the oceans, or where are offsets coming so that we can balance anthropogenic emissions with a reduction in forests, or what can ecosystems do as nature-based solutions. There is a sort of cross-cutting analysis, which is which are the new questions our specialists are beginning to develop. And also, OECD has different platforms that allow us to combine information and to answer complex questions using complex indicators, and that is a benefit. And Miguel Cárdenas is a specialist in that combination and overlap of databases, and in the next session, we will look at this relationship among many different indicators with analysis and maps to look at environmental threats in the region. So before going to Dimitra for the agenda, I would like to give some closing remarks by summarizing the most important items of this report. It is the first report, but it's also the basis for a series of actions that we are proposing in a new document called Action Plan. This is a climate action plan for resilience and carbon neutrality. This is a document that you can download. This is a cover page. And in this cover, we can clearly see the issues that we are facing. Over here, we see like a scale, and we see how water resources are decreasing in water bodies due to climate changes. But this is not just about water. This is also about biodiversity. Climate is changing. It is no longer reliable. We cannot predict. Hurricane experts are calling for new models for these new hurricane season with El Niño phenomenon that is becoming more intense and more permanent. And these are the new challenges that we are facing. This is one of two documents being presented. The other is the climate action plan, but we will talk about it later on. We will have a session similar to this one. So, Dimitra.
Thank you, Rodolfo. Thanks everyone for this session and for presenting the environment at a glance for the LAC region. We will now start our second session on climate-related hazards spotlight on the LAC region. This is a session that seeks to discuss climate-related hazards and how best to support evidence-based policy choices to address them. To moderate this session, we have Miguel Cardenas Rodriguez with us from the Environment Directorate. Miguel, the floor is yours. Please take over. Thanks.
Thank you, Dimitra. I'll switch to Spanish now in order to introduce this session. Bienvenidos a la segunda sesión.
Welcome to our second session, where we will be talking about risks and climate vulnerabilities affecting the Latin American region. This topic is urgent, as we've heard in the first session. It is vitally important given the vulnerability of the region and the importance of natural resources and ecosystems of this region at a global scale, and these resources are compromised due to climate change related risks. Today, we will have with us Michael Mais, GIS analyst at the OECD Environment Directorate, who will talk about the main regions affecting the Latin American regions and OECD's work in this area. Then we will hear Aloisio López Pereira de Mello, who's Director of Climate Policy at the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change in Brazil, and then Edgar Salinas, Specialist of Taxonomy for CAF Development Bank of Latin America. Michael, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias. ¿Me entiendes bien?
Thank you very much. Can you understand me? Can you hear me?
Buenas tardes y boa tarde. Me llamo Michael y yo trabajo como científico de datos medioambientales en la dirección.
I'm Michael and I work at the OECD's Environment Directorate as analyst. It is a pleasure to be here to present this project. This started 2 years ago, when OECD began to develop a set of indicators for monitoring exposure to climate risks through geospatial data analysis. We developed a series of maps of affected areas throughout time regarding climate risks to help public managers identify priority areas for climate action measures. After a careful identification of data sources, we developed risk and exposure indicators for 7 key risk areas: extreme temperatures, extreme rain, drought, fires, wind threats, floods, river floods, and coastal floods. We additionally investigated 4 exposure variables like population exposure, agricultural lands, forests, and built surfaces. The main objectives of this project include using geospatial products from different parts to develop common indicators that could be validated and analyzed through times, and that can be analyzed yearly. You can find more details about the methods in the OECD's report, Monitoring of Exposure to Climate Risks. I have here some examples of climate risks. For example, extreme temperature. Different indicators have been developed. A common index is days of heat, defined as days where maximum temperature goes above 35 degrees Celsius. When looking at the average for the last 5 years, we can see that the LAC region exposure to heat days has varies. We've also developed other indicators for extreme temperatures. For example, tropical nights, heat stress, ice days, and others. When we look at evolution in time compared to climatology, we can see that wide areas in Brazil, the north of Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula, and some other parts in South America have a substantial increase in the number of days of heat compared to climatology. And some of these are happening in dense populations as Santa Cruz de la Sierra in Bolivia or El Capital and Brasilia in Brazil. This shows that certain areas in Latin America are more affected than others in terms of extreme temperatures. And we must also point out that we are beginning to see changes in climate risks using historical observation data and not just prospective climate models. When we look at agricultural droughts, we see that there is an anomaly in soil moisture in the agricultural land of OECD's DC members in Latin America through 4 decades. When analyzing part of North America and Central America, we see the following. The north of Mexico has experienced a decrease in soil moisture compared to climatology. Some of these areas are areas of high agricultural activity, thus emphasizing the risks climate change presents to food production systems if there were to be an increase in droughts in the future. Now, regarding extreme rainfall, we are using an index developed for the European Environmental Agency, measuring daily rainfall that go above the 90th percentile when we look at the analysis. In this map, we can only visualize positive values. Droughts are seen separately, but we can see extreme rainfall in the north of the Amazonia. And this can be related to results in other research saying that atmospheric circulation changes increase rainfall in the north of the Floods and extreme rainfall are causing more and more issues in regions such as Manas, where floods have increased in the last decades. And now regarding fires in the South American region, we can see huge areas of land that burned down, and this is 2022 only. This allows us to see which regions of the country have a worst problem, and countries as Bolivia, Brazil, Paraguay, Argentina, Venezuela have fires in a significant part of their area in the last years. However, in terms of the surface of land that burned down in square kilometers, Brazil is #1. We must mention that the burned surface does not necessarily represent forest fires, because some countries also use certain techniques of burning in certain areas of their land. And risks don't necessarily represent a disaster, but they can inform us of the probability of a disaster. Right now, we were not able to find global geospatial data to evaluate vulnerability. However, this information will be important to evaluate total climate risk. We are also working on prospective climate risk indicators using prospective data from climate models, possibly focused on indicators such as heat index or sea level increases. And along with the AIE, we are developing a website where data will be visualized in a world map, and hopefully this will be finished and published this same month, July 2023. Thank you very much for your attention and for your interest. I'm really thankful. You can use these QR codes to access IPAC website, the OECD publication on climate risk, and the new OECD database, where you will find the information about climate risks. And please do not hesitate to email me or any of my colleagues. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Miguel. I'm going to switch into English.
Thank you. To start the discussion in this session, we have Aloisio Perez Pereira de Melo. As mentioned, he's director on climate policy for the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change in Brazil. I invite Aloisio to take the floor.
Gracias, Miguel. ¿Me escuchan bien?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Okay, thank you. Should I share my screen? Yep.
Yes,
okay.
Please.
But first, just to introduce, thank you for the invitation. First of all, thank you, Rodrigo, for the contact, and also Amy for the organization. It's very nice and a pleasure for us to participate in this dialogue. And I think this is a great opportunity for this issue for us in Brazil, since we are, let's say, resuming the actual implementation of our national climate change plan. We're starting the process to update the national plan for mitigation and adaptation through a very participative process. And it's also a very good moment because we, as you may have seen, climate change is a great priority for the government. President Lula is mentioning this in every opportunity. And we have actually climate change as a cross-cutting priority for the government, something like 17 ministries with actual mandates on climate change. So this is, I think, a very good moment for us to update our information and the bases we can reach in order to orient and prioritize our planning processes. Well, thank you for the, let me check if I can find my screen here. Just a moment. I'm just trying to find my, just a moment. Sorry for that. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Just to move quickly, thank you, and sorry for that. First of all, I think the report, I think it's very, as I mentioned, very useful for us, for our planning processes. I will mention that in the final slide, but I think the approach is very good because we can see, as mentioned in the report, not only the main indicators for the hazards and the exposure, but also the interaction or interconnection between different hazards and different exposures of the country. As mentioned, for instance, the relation between droughts and food insecurity, energy insecurity, the risk of wildfire. So the interconnection and the potential scale of those interactions, I think, is a very interesting and important approach for us to have the dimension of the threats and the kind of interactions between also domestic policies to address those. So I think it's a very good and important approach. I would like to mention, given that the selection of hazards and exposure indicators, one key topic for us in Brazil is adaptation, and in adaptation, the social human impacts of weather events, climate-related events. We have this database from this system, S2ID, which is an administrative system where we can, municipalities register the main disasters, and based on that, we build those atlas. It's let's say the database with the treated data in order to see the events and their impacts all over Brazil. Since 1991, and the last edition goes to 2022. So with this, we have those some hundreds of thousands of registers of disasters in the country. But the point here is that for us, a great priority is the climate-related events that are more important in terms of the impacts, the human damages, the impacts on population. As you can see in this data from that database, from the Atlas, 38% of the events are landslides, pluvial floods, flash floods, and intense rain, but they are responsible for over 70% of casualties, displaced, homeless people, and losses. So we have a great focus here on understanding the risks related to those threats. And maybe I think we are aware on the difficulties to have global database for vulnerabilities, and to understand those risks. Vulnerability is a key issue, but I think that maybe that could be maybe in future editions or advancing the work. There's some effort could be made in order to address other impacts related to extreme precipitation. I think the report is focusing on the impacts related to, or the exposure related to croplands for extreme precipitation. But for us, building build up areas, population exposed, and maybe infrastructure, public services exposed are key dimensions of risk related to extreme precipitation. So I think that is one area that for us, it will be important to have, let's say, more a broader view from a global perspective on where countries are in terms of risks related to, let's say, human impacts of extreme precipitation. We have an effort in Brazil related to that, which is a combination of these two instruments: the mapping of risk areas in a very small scale inside municipalities. We have something like 1,600 municipalities with this very detailed risk mapping. And in 2018, we made a combination from this data with demographic data in order to build a picture of the risks to those more relevant hazards in terms of human impacts. So at municipal level, the population exposed to the risks, and besides that or beyond that, the percentage or let's say the profile of the population exposed to that risk in terms of age, gender, race, income, and so on. So that was a big effort made in 2018, as I mentioned. But the challenge we have in Brazil is maybe the same challenge other developing countries have, is how to actually update and monitor those indicators, because we have to combine a mapping process, which is difficult, it's a big effort and hard to update, and the demographic data, which is also not easy to update or to build estimates on the advance of the demographic data. So how to monitor exposure and vulnerabilities to those climate-related events. I think it's a big issue for us in Brazil and other countries, because as developing countries, cities are constantly changing. They're growing, sometimes expanding without the proper infrastructure. So exposure is dynamic in some sense. So this is, I think, a big challenge we have. And just to mention, we have some initiatives. This is a database, a platform from the Ministry of Science and Technology, building indicators and aggregate indexes for adaptation related to different areas, water resources, food security, energy security, infrastructure, health, and disasters related to weather-related events, with indicators for vulnerability, exposure, and threats or hazards. Sorry, it's the first effort to build indicators that can be useful for planning and action at local level in Brazil. So where we are now, there's a coordination of a coordinated effort from the presidency to bring together different agencies to build a common database with the main indicators of exposure and vulnerability in the country at municipal level. And besides that, in aggregating to that database indicators for climate change scenarios. This is a work that is going on right now. And hopefully in a few weeks, we'll deliver, let's say, a ranking of municipalities in order to prioritize the federal support for adaptation and for disaster prevention at the local level. Besides that, I think, as I mentioned, the publication is very useful for us because we're going through different planning processes we are building the new National Civil Protection and Defense Plan, and coordinated with that, we're starting the review of the National Adaptation Plan. Both plans, they need to build clear indicators that can be actually monitored along their implementation. So I think these data sets, these indicators in the publication can be, I think, a good reference for us. And besides that, we are finishing the multi-year plan with the main plan for the federal government. And also that involves selecting indicators for adaptation, vulnerabilities, exposure, and the main hazards. So once again, thank you. And I think that can be very important, useful for us to have this view and a very friendly platform as presented by Sarah based on that publication. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eloiso, for presenting the work done in Brazil. It's a very interesting indicators. It's also very good that you're making the link to vulnerability and to the impact of populations. We now have another intervention. So me gustaría invitar a Edgar Salinas. Él es coordinador de financiamiento.
I would like to have Edgar Salinas, the head of the taxonomy of the Latin America Development Bank. You have the floor. Thank you. So can you see my presentation in full screen? Yeah. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Dear OECD colleagues, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me. And thank you to all panelists for your time this morning. So I would like to share the perspective from a developing bank, which does not necessarily align with commercial banking. For those who are not aware, with the organization CAF that was created over 45 years ago, well, I would like to outline the goals to promote sustainable development and regional integration while providing financial services. This is an important starting point because CAF directory is made up of the Minister of Finance and Economy, whose representatives may be here present today. I am very glad to have had Michael Mauricio to have you here, our delegate from Brazil. And so, having explained a climate risk, well, this aligns very well with what was explained by Michael. Climate risk is related to a threefold role: threats, including weather events, excessive rainfall, extreme weather events, and so on. Exposure, that is interest systems from a static viewpoint, i.e. schools, populations, natural capital, infrastructure, and so on. In order for a risk to exist, there needs to be a threat and an interest system. In isolation, none of it will result in it. So if there is no interest events in the Amazon forest, there won't be any risk events. Same thing for a city without a climate pressure. There won't be any climate risk resulting therefrom. So the bottom line is, or can be found at the right portion of the screen. There is a vulnerability or a level of likelihood to get a cold, for example. So you're eating right, you're working on right, but in a socioeconomic system, how vulnerable are we to withstanding the upcoming threats resulting from weather events? This results in a climate-related index. Since this workshop is related to public policy making, and also related to data and information. I would like to share a number of publications released by CAF in recent years. A local climate risk compendium. Information and data are typically found in either regional or global scale. So we need to downscale this, but which is a challenge. We managed to do this across 12 cities in Latin America. In the case of Brazil, there was Recife, Fortaleza, a consortium in Sao Paulo, and so on. So the idea or the bottom line as presented by Aloisio was to take raw data and to make sense out of it together with other data. We had the Minister of Science and Technology with the adapted platform, the civil protection system related to risks and so on. So we need to have all these data sets put together so that political power can either take immediate action or to raise it to the chambers. So very briefly, I would like to wrap up with a number of recommendations. We need to invest and highlight existing public policy instruments. This is really important. Here, I'm talking about an energy plan, a rural development plan, a macro sewage plan, the construction code, forestry policies, and so on. So having these public policy making instruments in mind, we need to create a climate agreement accordingly. The climate agenda is oftentimes creating new terms, net zero, carbon neutral, long-term strategies, and so on and so forth. These terms cannot be seized by the public sector. So if we want to go net zero, we need to go about the energy plan, the energy efficiency plan as regards the industry. All of that needs to be tied back to the international agreement agenda. The second recommendation on public policy making is related to having an effective role from the executive and legislative branches of the government so that we can have enabling conditions to invest. So everything that was presented by Ailis for the case in Brazil should be fed back into the legislative branch in Brazil. And I think the challenge there in Brazil is even greater because federal public policy making needs to be translated into state, prefecture, and municipal legislation. So there needs to be a link across the government in promoting investment across the private sector. We need to be disruptive. If we must engage in commercial banking, which is being done by our bank in requesting climate assessment in order to prevent a vulnerable event in the economy. So we need to ultimately be able to strengthen the knowledge creation agenda. Raw data cannot work in isolation. There needs to be cross-reference in order to strengthen result-based knowledge. So on climate change, mitigation, and adaptation, all of this will result in larger costs versus the existing trend, the business as usual trend. So this theoretically should come hand in hand with funding from the Climate Fund, the GAFT, and other bilateral efforts. And so these data may strengthen incur costs and avoided costs versus an ordinary political discourse in the prevailing setting. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your recommendations.
I would like to open the discussion. Well, first for the panelists, if you would like to address each other or ask your questions, but also from members in the chat, they can do so by clicking on reactions at the bottom of the page and raising your hand, and we can give you the floor. Also here in the room, if you would like to ask something to the panelists or a general topic for discussion. If not, I can ask, yes, please.
Si yo quisiera a lo mejor hacer una pregunta.
Yeah, this may be a question on how to put the climate risk map together with money distribution. For example, at the very beginning, there was a very detailed, even granular map presented for the case in Brazil where the risk is greater. So I don't know if you see the state of affairs as we do, like this need of knowing where the money goes and where whether the money is actually being funded, where the risks are present, and also how much money is going. So I don't know if we could potentially tackle this subject. I mean, of course, we may not have all of that information, but if we could potentially have that information, how to put together that database, that will be one question, because now we are experiencing a more granular financial information and risk-related information. Thank you. So this particular cross-reference I have not seen as of now. However, we need to create several agendas where several data sets could be overlapped with development banking, what it's doing in, what do you call this, operations control. Well, there is sovereign customer risk, whether a subnational government, where you could filter by prefecture, by Brazilian states, and so on. So there you will have the number of loans allotted by the World Bank and so on, depending on the systems. We also have centralized governments, right? Like the Minister of Agriculture, Public Works, and so on. So from there, we will need to define what is to become from these data, because if provided to the Ministry of Transport in Ecuador, I don't know, it requested 150 million to develop a road. So what does this mean? Okay, is this located on a vulnerable area? Does this contribute to reducing climate risks? And so on, this makes up our assessment. So there is some room for discussion there. What I have tried to promote across different fora is to potentially further reducing these steps. I don't know, Aloisa, if you could elaborate on this, because there is the risk-related map, the civil advocacy map, civil protection maps, and so on for the affected populations. But we need to know if per disaster and impact, would there be a likelihood of determining how much it costed for the population to be suffering from flooding and so on. Because if you have like a, I don't know, macro sewage that's gonna be worth 80 million, I'm going to have 20 million every time, or I'm going to raise it 20 million every time that we are experiencing more and more disasters and so on. Yep, if I may. I'm going to elaborate on this second question, and then I'm going to tackle the first one. This system that I talked about when it comes to disaster-related data, there is detailed information per event as recorded by municipality as regards disasters, human, economic, public sector related damages, and so on. So I don't think there is, as of now, is a systematic monitoring system as to the aggregate impact cost resulting from events. And so also from a public expenditure perspective, we are yet to determine how much is this related to public expenditure regarding disaster prevention, and also the cost related losses. We don't have the big picture yet as to the actual tax related and economic impact resulting from the events. However, we do have the detailed information, which is a good starting point. However, on local funding, we have a list that's being updated on the more exposed municipalities and a track record on the largest municipalities as part of our legal framework. The first accountable party of preventing is the local government, that is municipalities. However, there is financial capacities, and there are planning capabilities, preparedness, structural intervention related projects. So what we are looking at now is how to tackle both affairs, financial supports where is more needed, and how to support better capacities, technical assistance, so that interventions may be effective and can be begun and ended in due time with good project funding implementation. So this is on the one hand, funding implementation, because many municipalities cannot afford to run every angle. Also, there must be a capacities and management planning, preparedness, and management related efforts for those projects. And something which has not been talked about, there has to be an emergency, a climate emergency fund, because disasters are becoming a reality more and more. And so we must be able to effectively act on it so that a difference could be made on the long and medium term local impacts. So these are the main challenges that we are advocating most for.
We have a question from the chat, and this is for Michael. So now that this project is out on climate hazards and exposure to climate hazards, so what are the next steps for the project? And will you give us some insights on the ongoing work you're doing?
Yes, thank you for the question. So after this work was first published and available online on the database, there's now ongoing work, not just looking at historical indicators for climate hazards and exposure to climate hazards, but also to expand these with a set of indicators, forward-looking indicators for hazards and exposure to those hazards. This is limited in terms of the amount of indicators, because the amount of climate models that we find that we can use to develop those indicators is there's not as much data available as for actual observation values. That's ongoing work, and I think a second piece of something we would like to explore better is understanding what components of vulnerability we could use in the future for actually developing a set of indicators that is global for all countries worldwide that encompasses all three pillars of risk. So both the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability. I think Edgar very nicely showed this in his presentation as well, these three important domains for assessing total risk. And the reason why we haven't done that is because it's very difficult to find those global geospatial data sources at this point, especially if you want to go much more granular, onto for example, on a municipal level or city level or a state level, and not just the national level. It's also difficult, not just for the reason of spatial resolution, but also because sometimes vulnerability is dependent on the hazard you look at. If you think of population exposure to extreme temperature, you would think of vulnerable groups in the population, like elderly or very young people. While if we think of extreme precipitation and effects on built infrastructure, you would think of other types of vulnerability indicators, such as sewage infrastructure as an indicator of how vulnerable an area is, for example, to risk of flooding. So the vulnerability dimension also varies depending on the hazard you look at, and so ideally you also adapt that depending on the hazard setting. So I think that's a project that also in the future we would like to explore better once there's data availability.
I have a question for you, Lucio. You mentioned that the vulnerability work that you are doing is to inform, of course, your adaptation plan, your multi-year plan, and your national civil protection plan, but you also mentioned that it will inform your defense plan. I would like to know what kind of specific information for defense you are looking for that is not included in all the other plans.
Okay, sorry, maybe I did not communicate well. Is the civil defense plan related to disaster prevention and response? So these is the area, and we are connecting this to the adaptation plan. So they have in common the need to understand the existing risks, the existing local capacities to manage those risks. And they also have in common the need to understand what are the projected risks given the climate scenarios. So this is I think, one area we are making a very intense dialogue between the two areas: civil defense, civil protection, and adaptation, and also with the ministries in charge of delivering support to structural, non-structural interventions to reduce risks, which is like a Ministry of Cities, in charge of urban infrastructure, urban planning, and improving the quality of the drainage systems at city level.
Any other questions to the panelists or online?
Si no hay alguna, a mí me gustaría tomar una breve explicación.
If I may.
A Lois que está convirtiendo un diálogo, ¿no?
Yeah, this is becoming more of a discussion, and I would excuse for that. But in terms of the challenges, and this is for the audience to better understand this, how is the Brazilian government managing federal level policies all the way to the state level? So, for example, the Urban Solid Residue Act took a lot of time for municipalities to implement this. So in the case, or if this adaptation plan is updated, one, how will municipalities implement this, whether or not the ideal conditions are there? How will this trickle down to municipalities? And on the other hand, yeah, well, that will be basically my question. Yeah, that'll be 2 or 3 types of federal to municipal support. We have capacity related supports. This relates to technical support, training, methodology as we put together risk reduction local plans, adaptation local plans, climate action local plans, which are supported by the cities that you have talked about. And on top of this, financial support, which may be allotted to actions like risk prevention, containment, related funding, also reimbursable funding from federal funds to municipal funds. So we have a number of domains: financial support to municipalities. But yeah, everything boils down to the accountability pertaining to municipalities first and foremost. So the federal government must organize and put together their strategies so that projects could be created. However, municipalities must be able to identify the risks, to prepare action accordingly, and to implement them therefrom.
Thank you very much. Well, perhaps one last question from me. And this is especially in the region of Latin America, where do you see that there are the major information gaps in respect to climate hazards?
¿Era para quién la pregunta?
And the question was for both participants. Okay. Well, I wouldn't be able to point any fingers for political correctness, right? But I think information availability is related to the country's degree of maturity. In those countries where the rule of law has had investments, well, we can typically find some gaps when it comes to financial availability, to informational availability.
I think we have is to bring together, in the case of Brazil, they bring together the mapping work made by different institutions with different approaches, and also the monitoring, the databases that were built for different institutions for different purposes. So this, I think, is one of the areas that we need to advance. There is, I think, a big a range of data available in Brazil, but we need to make a better, let's say, integration and those data and produce indicators or information that can be directly used by those in charge of implementing the action, the local or the state governments, besides the different agencies in federal government. So integration, I think, is a big issue for us, and especially in terms of geospatial, georeferenced data to build common databases. But besides that, I think most countries, they are still not still able to make, I think, a good monitoring of the main variables related to vulnerabilities. As I mentioned, cities are dynamic. They expand, sometimes with a good infrastructure, sometimes not. So making a monitoring of the dynamics of expansion of cities, expansion of infrastructure, of the built-up areas, I think is a challenge for us. We have some pictures in some moments, but we don't have a system where we can identify what are the dynamics going on the ground, where risk is increasing actually, and also where we actually manage to reduce risk. So have this dynamic view of how risk is evolving, I think is a challenge for us, including to focus where the interventions are most needed. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much for this discussion. I think now we can move on to the next session. So I pass over to Dimitra.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo, everyone, for the very nice discussion. I suggest we move straight to our third session for the day on data gaps and information needs, proposal for a way forward. This session will be an opportunity to exchange views and experiences on climate information and data gaps and needs, and provide a way forward to address them. I would like to invite my colleague Amy, from whom we heard during the first session of the day, to moderate this third session. And I would like to invite everyone to be courageous and take the floor towards after the presentations, so that we can have a nice discussion on our next steps. Amy, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Dimitra. I will switch to Spanish, as I think all the interventions may be in Spanish. Pues en nuestra tercera y última sesión.
For our third and last session, we will talk about the need to improve the quantity and quality of environmental information, which is absolutely essential to build and reinforce evidence-based policies. And in the process of Environment at a Glance, the publication that we presented at first, different gaps of information were evident. And now, to go more in depth, I want to invite Mr. Rodrigo Pizarro, OECD Senior Economist, Head of IPAC, who will present data gaps so far identified and a proposal to move forward. Rodrigo, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. Let me share my screen with you. I have a brief presentation. I wonder if you can see that. Is that okay? Can you see that? It seems it's not yet in presenting mode. Is that right? There is still tools. So is it here? Do you know how to do it?
Pero no está en modo presentación.
Sí, algo pasa con la.
Es que compartir la otra pantalla.
Ahí. Bueno, creo que en este workshop ha pasado de todo, así que.
Well, everything has happened today to us, every possible glitch. So let's go on. Can you see? Well, as I was saying, good afternoon.
Presentation in Spanish for our Spanish colleagues, but I have left in English the presentation to facilitate the translation for our English colleagues. Let me just give you a few summary points of what we have learned as we have gone through this process. Entonces, quisiera hacer una muy breve presentación sobre...
This is going to be a brief presentation on topics arising regarding the way forward, the next steps in order to strengthen information in the region. First, some basic things. To be effective, public policies must be based on solid, reliable information. And that represents an important and yet difficult step. We know that environmental and climate change information and data in the region are limited and many times are inconsistent. They are related to different sources of information and different disparate methods, and many times even definitions vary, which leads to a series of issues when preparing and comparing indicators. Although this has improved, and we've seen many steps with the webbook and other projects, we know that information is still incomplete. And the question, therefore, is how can we move forward to fill the gaps and improve existing information? Let me reiterate the framework used by OECD, but also used in the PNUMAR books for basic environmental statistics and information development. You all know this model, pressure state response. This is the framework used by the Environment Directorate, used for developing this document. In these three areas, there's information that is relevant from drivers and emissions, impacts. In this case, we specifically talk about climate-related risks and vulnerabilities, and finally, mitigation, adaptation policies, and even though we have not mentioned it, opportunities for a just transition. In this context, evaluation gives us an analysis that, yes, has improved, but it's still worrisome because we don't have a consistent, comprehensive GHG emission data set for countries in the region and for each year. Also, when it comes to targets, information may be different, the scopes, different approaches. There's no consistent approach, and therefore we have to make some adjustments so that goals can be compared among countries, which was one of the most important issues that we discovered when doing our analysis. We've seen that there's no complete information about climate risks, and there are other issues regarding vulnerability, because this is about cross-referencing information from the different areas. There are little instruments. There's no characterization of these instruments, and therefore it is difficult to compare the different instruments in order to provide a guide to countries when it comes to best practices. I've been focusing on climate change related information, but it can also be seen in environmental. There is incomplete information on biodiversity, on wastes, and other environmental data. Consequently, we believe that there's a series of challenges. moving forward, which include or where we must acknowledge that even larger countries with more resources as Brazil, resources and capacities are still somewhat limited, and many times they are using or relying on international information, which is okay, but usually that international information has not been officially validated by countries. An example for emissions, the World Resource Institute, WRI information is widely used, and that information is not being validated or confirmed, and consequently, we really don't know much about this information, and yet it's still being used. And even when using information from international organization databases, concepts and methods may differ, and therefore it's very difficult to standardize or harmonize the information. And finally, gathering and processing data in this in the environmental field requires expertise in different areas, particularly related to geospatial and Earth observation data, which seems to be one of the best sources of information or to improve, especially as we've seen for vulnerability and risk. So regarding the next steps, we believe that we could be developing information by focusing on a certain core set of indicators regularly produced, officialized by countries, which is what OECD does by focusing through these environmental works, focusing on key indicators that can monitor and represent the environmental situation. But there are other objectives, which include capturing, harmonizing, and updating currently available and relevant information in the LAC region, or also sharing information to increase the information countries have, developing methods for using satellite and georeferenced information, Earth observation data, and reorienting or transforming information to make it relevant for public policies, as Mikhail emphasized in his presentation. It is also necessary to increase countries' institutional capacity. Some different countries in Latin America are of different sizes with different levels of institutional capacities, and therefore these capacities have to be strengthened in the region. But we must also work in mechanisms like other organizations are doing in order to develop an institutional method that can officialize and validate environmental information. We believe there is room to share information, to use international databases, harmonize methods with an information and verification process undertaken by countries. Finally, it is essential to communicate indicators to the different stakeholders and decision makers. And we believe that coordination among countries and international organizations, specifically organizations in the region, is important. This is crucial to create the necessary conditions to move forward. Finally, let me present the following structure. Over here, we have a data gathering, a possible approach in order to develop the core set of indicators through data gathering, data processing, and data validation and verification in order to develop these core indicators, and we can get this information from 3 areas: administrative and reporting data available from countries, information from the National Statistics Office, including surveys, questionnaires, and others. And finally, what we can get with new technologies, satellite or geospatial information, and other biological or physical data, which is really good. But we also believe that we should also be focusing on harmonization, consistency, and coherence when processing information involving international organizations or regional organizations to help countries to strengthen harmonization. And finally, create the necessary conditions, bringing together resources from countries for smaller countries, especially to validate and officialize information through an official consultation process. It's not surprising to say that we are thinking about a process similar to OECD's with working parties to officialize information through a formal consultation process, which could lead to the necessary conditions to formalize international information with countries by agreeing and confirming that information held is official information. Thank you very much for your time. And now I give time to our colleagues from LAC. Thank you very much, Rodrigo. This is very interesting. Now, let's hear Rolando Ocampo, Head of Statistical Division of ECLAC, and then Camina Clatres, expert from Paris 21 in environmental issues. Rolando, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, and good afternoon in Europe.
My name is Rolando Campos, the Statistics Director. Y es un placer estar aquí con...
It is a pleasure to be here with my friend Rodolfo Lassi. We know well, and we've faced many situations years ago when we were working in Mexico, fostering different activities in the environmental area. He worked at the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources, and I was at the National Statistics Office by creating different platforms presented by Mexico at COP21. And now, from the field of regional organizations, I am at LAC in Latin America and the Caribbean, and Rodolfo Lassi is at OECD, and we are still working on this area. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Ahora sí.
¿Ahora sí? Perfecto. Entonces, la voy a poner en...
Okay. Now, let's go to the presentation mode. I would like to present what ECLAC is doing and how to work in synergies between Latin America and the Caribbean regarding what's being presented today: climate change, availability of information, challenges in developing statistics. But I also want to talk what we are doing here, or what we call our data ecosystem. I'm going to go quickly over this. We all know that Latin America and the Caribbean make a very small contribution to climate change, but as has already been mentioned by our colleague from Colombia, vulnerability is high, impacts on people, on infrastructure are really high in Latin America and the Caribbean. Here we have some charts regarding CO2 emissions on one side, and on the other side, the number of events of floods and how this has been increasing until 2015 and 2020, then an increase in the number of floods and storms that mostly attack us in the region. We need information about climate change. The 2030 agenda, at least 70% of the goals and 50% of indicators are related to information, and they require environmental information, and including the Sendai framework and the Paris Agreement.
There is great interest in reporting this for the 2030 agenda and also as part of development plans. Rodrigo also spoke of the environmental pillar, which remains one of the weakest ones as part of the Statistics Bureau, which has been neglected across years. So we need to liaise between the environmental ministries and the statistics offices so that they both can complement each other and can prepare useful, more comprehensive information. We know that as defined by IPCC, there are 5 catalogs on drivers related to the industrial sectors, whose information, energy, culture, and emissions are more available. Also regarding the temperature and rainfall patterns are much more available and easy to interpret. However, when we talk about impact and vulnerability, there are some details on the occurrence and impact from disasters. However, there is little availability and harmonization on economic loss. A LAC is running a methodologies on this regard in order to identify the economic losses, the damage and loss assessment, among others. However, there is little to no systematization on this kind of information. Also, sea level change related information is very little. Also, mitigation related data on renewable energies, energetic intensity, soil coverage, and disaster has improved in terms of availability. We have progressed somewhat. However, when it comes to adaptation, there is little adaptation and systematization, albeit some positive notes can be said about our region. What is a LAC doing when it comes to liaising among the statistics office and the natural resources department and the sustainable development section? Well, our statistics platform includes information on the 33 state members and other associate members. We have information of any kind, including social, economic, and environmental information. When it comes to environmental statistics, we have the 75 plus indicators, the 110 series available across 30 years worth of coverage. We also have a dedicated chapter as part of our statistic yearbook where there are environmental statistics which can be used for research and public policy making. We also provide technical assistance among countries as we find statistics and help create indicators related to climate change. And we also have an environmental, climate change, and disaster related statistics regional network, which has remained operational for a number of years now. Now, very quickly, I'm going to walk you through LAC's efforts referred to as the data ecosystem. This is associated to our Secretary Generals and the data strategy within the UN. So from 2019, we have pulled our stats, data bank, and geographic layer data banks that have been put together with GeoSouth information transfer to a LAC. All of this information has become available, has been pulled. The document data bank has also been created with all geographic data associated to our library and our document database. So all of this information will be helpful in processing satellite imagery. We are putting together a project with the Sustainable Development Division. Also, economic-wise, we have developed industrial economic survey bank and a service survey bank and a household workforce survey where Latin America is being followed up on as we create socio-demographic data to estimate environmental issues. So we have a closed loop with all this information, which is being updated through APIs at any and all times as we create new elements and embed, for example, other issues such as the COVID-19 observatory when it became relevant. Now, what are the challenges in climate change related statistic production? Well, we have two key challenges as spoken by Rodrigo. We have methodology and institutional related challenges. On the one hand, we have insufficient or irregular data production from our domestic statistic systems. These need to be strengthened and worked on jointly as we consolidate them. We also need to standardize non-conventional data sources, including remote sensors, geospatial information, monitoring station, administrative records held by country and not necessarily statistically aligned. There is also a lack of agreement when it comes to vulnerability, adaptation, resiliency, environmental laws, methodologies, and so on, especially when it comes to the Caribbean, because they vary across Latin American regions. Maybe some of them will be more related to others. When it comes to hurricane seasons and so on. And institutionally wise, well, we have very little human and budgetary resources to maintain environmental statistic production. There is little technical capacities which have been identified through surveys existing and new ones as we try to identify new and updated capacities so that follow-up can be provided. Also, domestic agencies or ministries responsible for reporting these issues need to be working together. We need to ensure that they liaise among one another as we provide assistance or to LAC state countries, not only when it comes to the environment, but technical capacities and others which have to do with vulnerability. And also we need to strengthen technical capacities across these three domains as we help in these, as LAC helps with technical assistance. Now, down the line, we know that there is more available information on greater space coverage and coming from non-conventional sources, especially when we talk about the networks and the ensemble of agencies. We have LAMSA, we have information coming from the European Union and so on. So the bottom line is how to grasp this information so that we can produce quality comparable data sets which are comparable across time so that climate change can be monitored across our regions. These stats will and the resulting indicators will be helpful on a nationwide scale once these are reported back to the country so that agreements can be provided and so that we can compare the measurements and definitions across countries. So this information will be helpful in harnessing all this information coming from international agencies as a baseline for decision making on climate action. This is what we want to do down the line. We are helping to build this database, which can be useful not only for OECD countries, but for Latin American and Caribbean countries. And so I believe that liaising the works across these domains and these entities can lead us to positive results. This is the end of my presentation. And so if you have any questions, please go ahead. Thank you. Thank you very much. These are very interesting points as we try to create a new database set, especially including geospatial information to strengthen technical capacities across entities. This is really interesting. Karina will now take the floor whenever you want. Thank you very much, Amy. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on when you are, where you are. Now, I'm going to share my presentation momentarily. I would like to kickstart this by, well, let me just make sure that everybody's seeing my screen.
¿Me escuchan?
Sí, de momento.
Can you hear me? We can hear you, but we can't see anything.
Está todo congelado. Mira que tengo que salir y volver a entrar.
So yeah, I'm sorry, I need to log off, log back in. I don't know. Amy, do you happen to have my presentation? Yeah, sure.
Un segundo.
Yeah, sure. Perfect. Thank you.
Ya casi estoy. Genial.
Almost there.
Ya estoy listo.
Okay, done.
Karina, no te podemos oír si sigues aquí. Perdónennos, hemos tenido todo tipo de problemas técnicos hoy.
I'm sorry, we've had all possible technical issues.
Vale, creo que sería mejor idea pasar a
All right.
preguntas.
I think we would rather move on to the questions. So if participants have questions, please go ahead.
Sea tomando la palabra directamente aquí o por el chat.
You can either raise your hands or write them in the chat box. So yeah, I would like to know how this program aligns with ICMA.
Is that Amy? Should I answer that question?
Yeah, I think that'd be great.
Okay. So I work both with the EPI Environmental Division, and also I'm coordinating one of the modules of the ICMA. Y yo estoy coordinando uno de los módulos del ICMA y también trabajo
I'm coordinating one of the ICMA modules and also work for Environmental Directorate. ICMA stands for Inclusive Forum for Integrative Approaches. This project was issued by Secretary General as we prepare comprehensive information on public policy instruments on climate change in order to assess the climate change effectiveness in this regard. So we have these efforts to better the quality of information across a number of domains, including climate policy instruments through IPAC, and especially the KMF indicator. These efforts will coexist with a supplementary basic statistic data tool on public policy instruments, climate instruments, so that we can create a stock taking on all climate policy instruments characterized under a number of relevant domains. Therefore, there is a team liaising the OECD efforts. And so these efforts have a number of goals, but are jointly worked on as we try to better our statistical information with the ongoing national and international relevance on climate change. Thank you. I think Karina is back. There are also technical issues on her end. I don't know if you can share the presentation with me so that we can move forward.
Está en ello. Perfecto.
¿Me escuchan?
Sí.
Can you hear me?
Disculpen los problemas técnicos.
My apologies for technical issues. Okay, so we can move on to the next slide, please. All right, so as I was saying, Paris 21 will focus on strategic planning and domestic statistic office support. We have embarked in climate change related data efforts before presenting this framework and focus on climate change data and ecosystems. I would like to briefly refer to climate change data and as relates to countries. We have domestic stats offices related to this. Well, so we're talking about the environmental, social, and economic portion of this and how this impacts society and economics. So climate change data encompasses environmental data. For example, when we have seen the case of Brazil, there have been disaster management and so on. So when we talk about climate change ecosystem data, we're talking about not only data, but the stakeholders as part of this ecosystem. That is the statistic office stakeholders and private sector, the civil society, the academia, all of which can produce some pieces of information and strengthen capacities. They may even mobilize resources which are so dearly in need of on a national level. Now, when we talk about climate change data ecosystems, we are talking about the institutional level of this, tied to the mandates by the stats offices, the Minister of the Environment, who is the producer, who is the owner, who produces data, and so on. For some countries, they may be responsible or they may fall under the Paris Accord. So there might be an issue of coordination. So hence the importance of liaising this domestic statistics offices responsible for this and the ministries of the environment, which are typically responsible for reporting the agendas. Next slide, please. This is a visual depiction of the reality experienced by countries. There are data gaps, and the data may also be existing within an agency, an office, a ministry. So the ultimate goal from Paris 21 is to first and foremost identify the ecosystem, their owners, producers, so that we can provide the necessary tools for the ministries of the environment and the stats offices so that resources and stakeholders can be mobilized in a more consistent way, and so that the data can be harnessed not only for their particularly reporting purposes or the matrix or database creating purposes for the ministry, but for national public policy making and also for regional and global engagement commitment purposes too. Next one, please. This is intended to show you very briefly the framework that I'm talking to you about, which is being implemented across 3 countries, Senegal, Grenada, and Belize. Also coordinating with regional stakeholders, including LAC in the LATAM region and the Caribbean region on a global scope with the UN Statistics Office. So the ultimate goal is to lay the technical foundation and the results found from these stakeholders, by these stakeholders in terms of challenges and the way forward. That is how can countries be equipped with the necessary data and capacities. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So here I'm going to go more granular about it in terms of the framework as we mobilize the climate change data indicators. It has to do with priorities. That is the priorities by countries, the core set that we were talking about, that is talked about on a regional level, but which has a domestic starting point too, in terms of the indicators that need to be prioritized by countries. If we were to enlist the domestic national plan goals, the 2030 agenda, the Paris Accord, and all the other engagements across multiple levels, we will wind up with multiple indicators which may overwhelm the countries and the small offices, which will be understaffed because of social and economic issues. So we need to get our priorities straight so that these indicators can be managed according to each country's capacities. Once our priorities are straight in terms of indicators and the multi-use that we can have, well, we can move on to the gaps, not only when it comes to the lack of data or harmonization therein, but also the country capacity strengthening so that we move on from consulting efforts and reporting efforts where countries can no longer produce data or follow up on the existing reports, but rather to prepare and construct the national capacities as part of the statistics office. So this is a third step, right? We need to engage all stakeholders. This is from step 1, right? We need to be able to identify who the actors are, not only from the domestic stats office and the government agencies, but beyond, how the academia, the private sector, and other stakeholders like the civil society can be helpful. So first result will be having the country's priorities, what they need, so that we can ultimately develop a realistic action plan with very clear goals and a very clear time frame. Let's say 5 years, so that we can harness the climate change data for dedicated policies and commitments.
¿Cuál es el costo de estas actividades?
Very clear activities and the cost thereon. So, and also the level of help across the Ministry of the Environment.
que pueda ir con los socios del
This is to mobilize stakeholders and resources to look at the needs that we have on a country level, their priorities, and the cost. With this information, we'll be able to consolidate the projects and access some funding focused on some of the areas they have identified as of high priority. So as we map, we need to identify the stakeholders so that countries can easily implement and mobilize the resources and assets.
Una vez más, una disculpa por la falla.
This is the end of my presentations. Then again, my apologies for the technical glitches, but hopefully I have caught up with the time. Amy, you will have the floor back, and I'm ready for any questions if there are any questions.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. If you have questions, ideas, or proposals to improve our efforts regarding climate data, so if there are questions, please go ahead. If not, we'll get ready to close the session. Well, if there is no comment, thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you very much for your time and your patience, especially with the technical issues. Thank you very much. So this is the end of our third session. Demetria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amy. Yes, today we had every case of like something going wrong that could happen, but that's okay. That means that we can only have positive things from now on, and we're almost at the closing. I would like to invite Rodolfo Lassi to take the floor and quickly, very quickly, in 2-3 minutes, give us like the key outputs or outcomes he would keep from the discussions that we heard today. Thank you.
Sí, thank you, Dimitra. Bueno, muchísimas gracias a todos por su participación.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everyone for your participation. All of our presenters gave us a highlight at the end of their presentations by giving us the most important topics. When you go over the document from today, please send us feedback regarding the steps to follow from your countries based on your needs and your platforms. The last presentation from Rolando is very important because it shows the capacity our countries have and their work with different partners in order to create synergies for collecting, processing, and presenting data. Rodrigo very clearly stated that what we want is, first of all, to fine-tune climate policies, but also follow up climate policies and see how they truly help to change reality in Latin America and the Caribbean region. This document presented today is the basis for this second document for climate action, which we are presenting. This will be presented at the ministerial meeting in October. Now I will give the floor to José Antonio Ardavin. He is head of the LAC division at OECD Global Relations and Cooperation Directorate. It has to do with all the work of OECD in this region. This is related to everything that we are doing with our partners at the United Nations, particularly ECLAC, but also financial actors such as CAF and all the work that's being done in the region. I want to reiterate my thanks for your participation. And we will be even more thankful if you could send us comments and reactions to the document we are presenting today. Thank you very much.
Jose Antonio, the floor is yours. If you would like to come to say a few words on the next steps of the LAC regional program.
Thank you, Dimitra. Bueno, también aprovecharé la traducción.
Thank you very much. Since we have interpretation services, I will use it, and I want to greet all my colleagues and congratulate my colleagues from the Environment Directorate, because this is one of the most important and newest deliverables of the LAC regional program. As you will remember, last year, this new priority of environmental sustainability part of the program was approved, and we are already see some results like the economic outlook launched a couple months ago. Now this one, environment at a glance, having reliable, comparable statistics for Latin America is a public good for OECD. It is extremely relevant and it is available to everyone. And we are very happy to have support from LAC and CAF and some other organizations joining into this effort. As we said, we have information, but there are also a gap, and this data gap is a reality that we are facing, which means we need a lot more coordination. But OECD is making an effort to bring this information available to the public, which is a great contribution in itself. Finally, as Rodolfo was saying, along with our colleagues, we are preparing a substantive publication that will be presented at the ministerial meeting on October the 5th in Costa Rica. All institutions, stakeholders, and participant countries are invited to join this meeting. This meeting is a great start. It's not the end. A lot of these products will be presented, but this is the beginning for an OECD mandate to work on environmental sustainability along with other institutions and organizations. And we will be presenting a publication that is being developed now, and the action plan Rodolfo and other colleagues have mentioned will be presented. It's a series of very specific recommendations. We had a Summit of the Americas last year, the Ibero-American Summit this year. In a couple of weeks, the European Union Latin America Summit will take place, and in all of these summits and the Paris Summit, big or great commitments are being made by the region, but these commitments must become something tangible, something concrete. And this action plan help us with a 40-point agenda, 15 adaptation, 15 mitigation, and 10 more cross-cutting to help the region identify and advance in some concrete items of the agenda. So hopefully this action plan, already available for countries and institutions, will be very interesting, and we are expecting comments from here to September to make all the necessary adjustments to present in October and help the countries in the region to move forward. With no further ado, I want to congratulate my colleagues. I was browsing Latin America at a glance. It's online. I invite you to read it, to send your comments, and to continue with this effort. This is a very important deliverable of the LAC program, and in the 4 years, in the next 4 years, a lot of work has to be done to help the region addressing this huge challenge, which is climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jose Antonio, for these words and for closing up today's meeting with what you've said is the beginning of the next phase or our next steps on environmental sustainability work in the LAC region. This is actually the last of our series of workshops and regional policy dialogues that we have organized during 2022 and 2023 from our side, but we are looking forward to inviting everyone again in 2024 in new discussions if possible. So let's see how the ministerial will go and how countries would like to continue the cooperation with the OECD. I'll leave it to here, and I would like to say to everyone good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Bye, everyone.